Hi everybody, I'm here with retired Lieutenant Commander Jocko Willink, who is a highly decorated Navy SEAL. During his 20 years of service to America, he earned the Silver and Bronze Star and numerous other awards. He was the commander of Task Unit Bruiser, the most highly decorated special operations unit of the Iraq War. After he retired from the military, he founded a leadership consulting company called Echelon Front, which has clients all over the world. And in the last 2 years, he's written 3 books on leadership for adults, including Extreme Ownership, which has sold over 2 million copies around the world. He's also the author of the best-selling children's series, Way of the Warrior Kid. I wanted to interview him because he's not only passionate about history, he's become a part of it. True American hero. Mr. Willink, thank you so much for being on today. With everything you've accomplished, we got a lot to talk about, but I'd like to start with your military career. What made you want to become a Navy SEAL?
When I was a little kid, I liked playing Army a lot. And that's all I really remember wanting to do, is be some kind of a soldier. And eventually I found out about special operations, and eventually I found out about the SEAL teams, and I knew that they were involved with working in the water, and I really liked being in the water. And so it seemed like an obvious choice for me.
When did you begin your SEAL training?
Well, I joined the Navy when I was 18 years old. And then I went through Navy boot camp, went to SEAL training. So I had turned 19 when I got there. So that's when I started it, yeah.
What was the most important lesson you learned from your SEAL training?
Well, the thing that the initial SEAL training is doing, really, is weeding people out that don't really want to be there. So my SEAL BUDS class, it's called, it stands for Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training. And my SEAL training class started out with hundreds of people, and we graduated with 35. So most people quit, and what I learned is don't quit.
Well, I think that's a message that plays all throughout your books. You once described being the commander of a SEAL team as fun. What made it fun for you?
Yeah, well, what makes it fun for me is the people that you get to work with and the mission that you have. And if you like things like being outside, and you like things like shooting machine guns, and you like things like jumping out of airplanes and scuba diving, like all those things, if you like those things, it's probably the funnest job that I could possibly imagine. And of course, there's some things that are not fun. And when you're going to war and people are being wounded and or killed, obviously that's not fun. That's part of the job, and that's part of the sacrifice that U.S. military people make, and it's part of your responsibility as a leader to guide the teams through those situations when you get there.
Yeah, and it's so hard for us as civilians to understand what servicemen and women go through, and I really appreciate what they do. What was your first assignment in the military?
Well, when I got done with basic SEAL training, I was assigned to SEAL Team 1 in Coronado, California in 1991. And when I got there, the first thing that I was assigned to do was what all the new guys get assigned to do, which is clean up around the compound, clean the bathrooms, clean the toilets. That's what we did. It's a very humbling experience. You get done with the most elite training in the world, and you end up cleaning toilets. But that's part of growing up. Part of growing up is that you're going to have to do some things that you might not feel like doing, so you do it to the best of your ability. Get yourself a good reputation as a hard worker, and try and move on.
Now, when you were deployed to Ramadi, Iraq, what position did you hold during operations in the city?
Well, I was a task unit commander. So in the SEAL teams at the time, a task unit consisted of 2 SEAL platoons. So I had 2 SEAL platoons underneath me, and the various types of missions that we were doing ranged widely in what the actual mission consisted of. Sometimes it was 5 or 6 guys going out into the city for a sniper overwatch position. Sometimes it was 3 or 4 guys going out advising on a Iraqi patrol. Sometimes it was the whole task unit going out to do a coordinated search of an area. Sometimes it was direct action missions to capture or kill enemy personnel. So where I was during any particular operation really depended on the particular operation that was being conducted. And whatever that situation dictated, I put myself into the best possible position to help support the troops that were on the ground.
And in Extreme Ownership, I saw a picture in the book, that's his leadership book. I saw a picture of your headquarters, and didn't it say, I think it said in the book that they were held by, they used to be held by members of the Saddam Hussein regime before the U.S. came in and occupied. What was your ultimate mission or goal in Ramadi?
Well, the mission in Ramadi was to stabilize and secure the city from insurgents that had been there terrorizing the local populace. That was the mission.
What was the worst part about being in the city?
The worst part about being in the city was U.S. and coalition forces being wounded and killed every day.
Now, tragically, of course, along that, during the Battle of Ramadi, the counterinsurgent forces lost two Navy SEALs, Mark Lee and Mike Mansour. And later on, of course, Ryan Job didn't die on the battlefield. He died from wounds, from complications after a surgery to take care of his wounds after he had been blinded, and he had already left Ramadi. What impact did their deaths have on you and your men and the mission you were trying to accomplish?
Obviously, it's a massive impact on everyone in our task unit and really everyone that we were serving with. And what we had to do was see them off. We had to honor them to the best of our ability, and then what we had to do is go back and continue to execute our missions on a daily basis. And that's one of the hardest things to deal with in war, is you're going to lose people, and anyone thinks that that you're going to have war without death is being very naive. When you go to war, there's horrible things are going to happen, and one of those things is that you're going to lose people. So what we did was we tried to celebrate their life to the best of our ability while we were there, and then we had to lock and load our weapons and go and continue on with the mission.
Yeah, and you've certainly kept their legacy alive by dedicating each one of your books to them. And like I said, I think it's so hard for people as civilians to understand what that's like. And even when I've been reading about different points of history, about generals who would send their men into battle and thousands would just get killed, like they were just pieces on a board to be sent and killed. But each one of them had a life, had a family, had a brother and sister and a mom and dad. And it's so hard to understand unless you're there, unless you've been impacted by their deaths. And of course, I'm sure it gives you a real feeling of wanting to get back at the enemy for what they did, and like you said, renewing your mission, wanting you to accomplish it even more by, I guess, avenging their deaths. When did you come home from serving in Ramadi?
I came home October 21st, 2006.
Were you relieved to be back?
I really didn't feel a sense of relief for a couple months after I got home. When you first get home, you really can't quite compute to the fact that there's no one trying to kill your friends, and that's because you're so used to that feeling deep in your heart that something bad could happen. And so when you come home, for me, it took a while to realize that that was no longer a threat from my guys. Of course, you're still concerned about the troops that are still overseas, but for my direct guys, it took about a month for that feeling to subside, and I started to wake up in the morning and not be paranoid to hear the latest news. So when I came home, that was the major adjustment that I had to make. It wasn't any massive problem, but just the sense of relief after a while that the guys that were home were home.
And during your time of deployment, your wife, of course, was at home looking after your children, and you've said on your podcast that she was very supportive of you during your military career. What effect did that have on you while you were in Iraq?
The fact that my wife was very strong and independent and squared away on the home front meant that when I was overseas, I could concentrate on fighting the war and not have to worry about the kids, the water heater, the flat tire on the car. My wife wouldn't even tell me when those things happened. She would just get them handled. She didn't complain. She was just happy to hear from me and allowed me to do my job. And she knew I was trying to look after all the guys that were with me, and that was where my focus needed to be. And because she was handling things on the home front, that's what it allowed me to do.
That's incredible. And of course, another part to service families is, of course, the men and women who are actually out there fighting, but also the family who stays behind, who has to live without one of the key members in it. And women have especially done that all throughout our history, like especially during World War II, when there were women here doing so much work here, working in the factories and doing so many things to help the men and women who are out there actually fighting the battles. And it's, I think it's incredible that she remained that strong throughout it, and even though you were gone for such long periods of time. After you returned home, what was your next assignment with the military?
When I got home from that deployment to Ramadi, I took over the training for the West Coast SEAL teams. And the training that I took over was the tactical training where SEALs are learning to shoot, move, and communicate, where they're learning to maneuver on the battlefield effectively as a team, and where they're learning combat leadership.
Now, when were you actually demobilized?
You mean when I retired?
Well, yeah, when you retired from
I
the
retired in
military.
2010.
2010. So 20 years of service. After you came home, you started your company, Echelon Front. When was that?
2010.
2010. And what do you actually do in this business?
We work with various businesses of all sizes, and we do leadership consulting to get their leadership aligned and get their leadership firing on all cylinders, because when a company or a business or a team has a problem, it's a leadership problem. It's 100% a leadership problem. And so when you can fix the leadership, you can fix the problems. And that's what we do. We help companies fix their leadership.
Huh. And in your book, Extreme Ownership, you have a phrase, no bad teams, only bad leaders. So I'm sure that's a principle that comes into play a lot when you're talking to these businesses about when there's, like, when I read about the stories in here of you helping business solve their problems, and it's finger pointing, and it's leaders pointing to other people saying, no, it's your problem. No, this isn't why it's solved. And then you have to look at them and say, no, you need to take extreme ownership of this problem. And speaking of which, about your first book, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, once I was working with businesses, the demand signal started to increase, and Leif Babin, who wrote the Extreme Ownership and wrote Dichotomy of Leadership with me, he was one of the platoon commanders that worked for me in the Battle of Ramadi. We're great friends, and he was getting out of the Navy right around the time when I was starting to get a lot of business, and I said, hey, I need some help over here, and he came on board. We joined forces, and then as we started to talk to all these different companies, the companies would ask for some kind of document,
right,
some kind of written handout that we could give to them. And eventually we started writing more and more, and eventually that turned into the book. And a literary agent got a look at the book and said, hey, I can sell this. And we said, sure enough, sounds good. I didn't know that it was going to be as successful. It's been very successful, luckily. But when you write a book, you never know what the success of it's going to be. In fact, the publishers don't know, the bookstores don't know, no one knows. The only people that judge the performance of a book is the actual public. And so we wrote it, and it got out there, and it got some really good traction because the lessons are fairly universal. They can be applied to any leadership situation, and when people apply them, it improves their situation, makes their business better, makes their life better, and that's why the book's been popular.
Yeah, and the public has definitely shown its approval. #1 New York Times bestseller, #1 Wall Street Journal bestseller, more than 2 million copies sold. It's incredible. So, extreme ownership, could you explain that concept?
I think you actually already explained it. What extreme ownership is not making any excuses, not blaming anyone else or anything else when something goes wrong. And as a leader, that's what you have to do. If you're in charge of a team and the team fails for any reason, you have to look at it and say, this is my fault, I'm in charge, what can I do to make sure this never happens again and make sure we can get on the right track? And when you do that as a leader, guess what? You find those problems and you get them solved. If instead you say, well, it's not my fault and it's not the team's fault, it's the fault of the competitor or the enemy or the weather or whatever thing you want to blame, then you don't have to change anything. Mm-hmm. And when you don't change anything, you don't get any better, and you continue to fail.
Right, and it takes a sort of, well, not a sort of, it takes humility to step up and do that, and to have the maturity to say, this is my fault. Even though maybe there were people under me that technically made the mistakes, I'm over them, I'm overseeing. It's my job to make sure that they don't make those mistakes. And you've said before that extreme ownership you've really been benefited before by applying that right into your military career and service. Can you tell us about the incident that stands out to you most when you had to step up and take extreme ownership?
The highlight of extreme ownership that we put into the book was a situation that took place in the Battle of Ramadi, where there was a fratricide, which, if people don't know what that is, that's when friendly forces kill friendly forces by accident. And there was a fratricide that took place while I was in charge of an operation. There was a friendly Iraqi soldier that was killed and several that were wounded. One of my guys was wounded, and again, this was all friendly fire. And when that happens, this is one of the worst things that can happen in war. And when this happens, of course, people want to lay the blame somewhere. And even for me, as I looked at what had occurred, I had the feeling of, well, you know, this guy made this mistake and that guy made this other mistake and another guy made this different mistake. Who should I blame for this? And as I sat there and tried to figure out who I should blame, every time I pointed the finger at someone else, I knew in my heart that there was only one person that should be having the finger pointed at them, and that was me. And so I took ownership of the situation, explained to people the mistakes that I made, and what we were going to do to make sure that we didn't ever make those mistakes again.
And like I said earlier, that takes incredible humility to keep your ego in check, and no matter what feelings are inside of you, to realize that it is your fault and to do that. And you devoted an entire chapter in this book to the fact that leaders need to keep their ego in check, and you talk about it in your Warrior Kid books too. Why do you think humility is the most important leadership quality?
If someone isn't humble, then they think they know everything, which means no one can tell them anything, which means they don't take any advice, which means they don't even look at themselves and try and see where they can improve because they think they're doing everything perfectly. So you add all those things together, you don't listen to anybody, you don't take any advice, you don't look to improve yourself, you don't look to improve your methodologies, you don't look to improve your technology because you think you do everything perfect. That is a recipe for disaster. And I saw it happen many times when I was training SEALs. The young leaders that weren't humble, that thought they knew everything, those are the guys that would end up getting people killed or end up failing missions because they wouldn't listen to anyone else. So that's why I consider humility to be the most important quality for a leader to have. Because if you're not humble, you don't listen to anybody, you don't get coached, you can't improve.
Right.
And it's just a disaster.
In chapter 9, entitled Plan, here it is. This quote, it really stuck out to me. You quoted John Paul Jones, father of the American Navy, who said, "Those who will not risk cannot win." How do you understand this quote and the principles it implies?
The quote is a pretty straightforward quote. If you don't take any risk, you're not going to win. And this became very clear in the Battle of Ramadi, because in the Battle of Ramadi, every single time, anyone from any of the units that were there, the Army, the Marine Corps, any of the units that were there, when you left to go out on an operation, there was a chance, and in sometimes a high probability, that you were going to get into enemy contact and that you might suffer, your personnel being wounded or killed. So every time you are going to take that risk. Well, you could say that, well, we don't think that risk, we don't want to take that risk, so we're going to sit here inside of our compound that's guarded with big walls, and we're sitting inside these bunkers. Well, here's the deal. If you do that, there's no way you're going to make any progress. In fact, when you stay inside the wire and you stay inside of a bunker and you hide from the enemy, guess what the enemy's going to do? They're going to maneuver, they're going to get the high ground, they're going to plot attacks on you, and they're going to win. So what you have to do is you have to take risk. If you want to have any victory in life, there's going to be risk. Anything worth winning is going to take risk. So you have to weigh it. You have to mitigate the risk as much as you can. But even when you mitigate risk as much as you can, there are still things that you cannot control. Whether it's business, whether it's war, or whether it's your own life. You mitigate the risk as much as you can, but you have to take some risk in order to move forward, in order to win.
It's a great leadership point. And another leadership topic you mentioned in here that really stood out to me was in chapter 10, when you discussed the principle of leading up the chain of command. Now, I think most of us understand, especially me, because it was kind of counterintuitive to me. When I think of leading, I think of the people under you, but you introduce in this chapter the concept of not leading down the chain of command, not as much leading the people below you, but leading up the chain of command to your superiors. What do you mean by that concept? Because like I said, it's kind of counterintuitive. It's not the way most people think.
It's very counterintuitive, and a lot of people don't think about that at all. And yet it's one of the most important things that you are doing as a leader is to lead the people above you in the chain of command so that they know what you're doing, they know what you need for support to make things happen. They know what you're going to do if you make a mistake. They know everything that you intend to do. Your leadership has to know and understand that. There's something else that happens. Sometimes when you're on the front lines, you see things or you understand things that maybe your leadership doesn't understand or doesn't see. And it's no offense against them. How are they supposed to see what's going on the battlefield? They're in a tactical operations center 40 miles away or 100 miles away or 1,000 miles away. They can't know what's happening on the ground. So what you have to do is provide them leadership. Even though you're below them in rank, you still have to provide them leadership so that they are moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
Sometimes strategically, they can make bad decisions or they can have bad strategies that don't make any sense. It's your job as a frontline leader or in any leadership position to make sure that you lead up the chain of command so you guide people in the right direction.
Right. And of course, you talk about in the book the balance between flat out disobeying an order that's immoral or wrong or that is not going to benefit the mission, but yet at the same time, you say that you have to recognize that there are people above you and your job is to accomplish the mission, and it's their job too. They're trying to accomplish the mission as well. And so, of course, it's important to find that balance between, I shouldn't say challenging an order if it's wrong, and even if or an order that maybe it just doesn't suit your opinion or it's not exactly what you like, but you still have to obey it because they're above you. And I think that's something not everybody likes to do because our tendency as humans is to resist authority and to push back against submitting to something that we don't want to, or that kind of pushes us out of our comfort zone. And
well, those are very nuanced pieces of leadership that make leadership challenging. If it was as easy as you're my boss and you come up with a plan, and every time that you come up with a plan, I think it's the greatest plan I've ever seen, and I say, hey, thanks Solomon, great plan, I'm going to go execute it. And then I tell it to all my guys, and they all say, wow, that's a brilliant plan, and everyone go get it done. That would make leadership, military leadership, and all leadership very, very simple. The problem is that you're not always going to come up with the best plan, and for the very reason I just talked about. I might see something on the battlefield or on my job site or in my department that you don't really see because you're elevated, you're looking at a bunch of different things. I'm only looking at this one small thing. So when you give me direction, it might not be direction that I agree with. So that's when we get into this point of, well, how do I push back? How do I give you feedback respectfully? Yeah. How do I get to a point where I say, you know what, you're actually asking me to do something that is, well, it's either illegal, it's immoral, or it's going to get a bunch of my guys wounded or killed. And then are there times when I say, you know what, Solomon, I know you're outranking me, I'm not doing it. Mm-hmm. I'm not doing it. And even that sometimes is, there's risks when you do that, because if I work for you and you tell me to do a mission that's going to get a bunch of my guys killed, and I say, hey, you know what, Solomon, I'm not doing it. And you know what you say? Okay, fine, Jocko, you're fired. And you bring in someone that will obey your orders without question. Now that guy says, yes, sir, goes out and executes the missions and gets a bunch of guys killed. It probably would have been better for me to say, you know what? Hey, I really disagree with the way that you want me to do this, but you're the boss, and I'm going to go make it happen to the best of my ability. And then we go out and mitigate the risk to as much as we can and try and pull off the mission without incurring casualties. Now, I'm sure you've seen the mini-series Band of Brothers, right?
I've heard of it. I haven't watched it.
Well, there's a scene in that which really displays this well. There's a guy named Dick Winters who is a great leader, and he gets ordered. The war is all but over. They're days away from the war being over, and Dick Winters gets ordered to send some of his guys across this river on a reconnaissance. He says, hey, I don't know if we should do this. There's no real reason. And his superior officer says, nope, you're doing it. And so Dick Winters says, okay. So they load up these little boats, they go across the river, they get into a gunfight. One of the guys gets killed. A couple guys get wounded. It's a bad situation. I don't remember the exact details, but it's bad. They come back. The mission's complete. The next day, his superior officer says, do another mission, same mission as last night. And Dick Winter says, hey, I don't think it's worth doing. We already lost a guy yesterday. I think we should just sit over here and observe from this side of the river. He says, nope, you go send some guys over there. And Dick Winter says, okay, sir, got it. And he takes his team and they go into the basement of one of the buildings and they never go across the river. They sit there and play cards and come back and say, hey, we went across the river, we didn't see anything. So that's an example of where if he would have said, you know what, boss, I'm not going to do it. You can fire me. The boss would have said, okay, you're fired.
Yeah.
And someone else put him in charge, and now that person's going across the river, and maybe they're losing more people. So there are times when, as a leader, you have to disobey, but at the same time, you got to figure out when you're going to play the game. This is what makes leadership hard.
Mm-hmm. And besides concepts in here being nuanced, like you said, there's also concepts, as I mentioned earlier, that seem, at first when you hear them, counterintuitive, kind of like what we just said with leading up the chain of command. Another one which makes sense once you hear it explained, is discipline equals freedom. And I know it's something you say a lot, and it's also the title of another one of his books, Discipline Equals Freedom. Field Manual, another great book. I know it's one of your favorite sayings, and what do you mean by it? What are the concepts behind it, and how did you see it actually played out in real life in your military career?
In the military career, it was very easy to see it play out. The more discipline you have in your life, in all aspects of your life, the more freedom you're going to have in all aspects of your life. That's the way it works. If you're a person that in the SEAL platoon gets to work early, has the discipline to have your gear ready, has the discipline to understand, study the tactics and know them, has the discipline to learn the different weapon systems, has the discipline to learn how to operate all the radios. If you have that kind of discipline and you can prove those skills to your leadership is going to give you all kinds of freedom to make things happen, to run missions, to participate in missions, to make decisions on missions. So you're going to get all kinds of freedom because you have discipline. It's very easy to see in a SEAL as an individual. In a SEAL platoon, it's the same thing. If you have a disciplined SEAL platoon that all has disciplined standard operating procedures, and they're all wearing disciplined, same looking uniform, and they're using the same weapon, and they have the same disciplined firing skills, guess what? That platoon is going to have way more freedom out on the battlefield, because if we have the discipline to train hard and we have the discipline to have the same standard operating procedures, and you get shot, and I need to save you, I walk over to you. If we have a disciplined standard operating procedure, guess how long it takes me to find your med kit on your gear? It takes me 1 second, because you have it in the same place that I have it. That requires discipline. It seems small, but that requires discipline. I walk over to you, I can immediately get to your med kit, I take it out, I can save your life, because we have disciplined standard operating procedure. Something as simple as we all keep our medical kit in the same exact spot on our gear, so anyone can find it in the middle of the night, in dark, while people are screaming and panicking and bullets are flying, we can still get it done. So that's an example of how discipline will give you the freedom to, in this case, gives me the freedom to get over, work on you quickly, and get your life saved, because we have discipline.
Yeah, and another story you tell in this book is when your SEAL teams had to clear buildings. Either you were going in to get a terrorist, or you just had to clear the buildings and make sure there wasn't anybody left inside. And your guys kind of had their own system where they just went in and smashed everything, and the room was a disaster afterwards, and they had cleared it. But then you put principles in place that at first they were a bit resistant to, because most people don't like change. But when you had the discipline to come up with a system for clearing the room so that people knew what was done, knew each room was clear, and I think you got it down from 45 minutes to clearing a building to 30 minutes and then to 10 minutes, which of course gives you more free time, but time to do other things, which beforehand, with that lack of discipline, that time would have been wasted doing the old system. So discipline equals freedom.
In that example, the way it played out was, instead of us being able to assault 1 target per night, we could assault 3 or 4 targets per night. We didn't always get to do that, but we had the capability, we had the freedom to do that, because we had disciplined standard operating procedures.
So everybody, Extreme Ownership, it's a great book. I highly recommend you buy it right now. There's a link below this video to purchase it. Now your second book, leadership book, Mr. Willink, The Dichotomy of Leadership. Again, another great book. What was your purpose in writing this book? Because you have so many concepts covered in extreme ownership. What else did you feel that you needed to talk about that resulted in this book?
The main principle in that book, as the title states, is this dichotomy of leadership. And that is the fact that you can take any of these leadership principles or leadership characteristics, which are very, very positive, and if you go to the extreme with them, they will become a negative. So we already talked about humility in this interview. Is there such a thing as being too humble? Well, the answer to that is, oddly enough, yes, there is. Because if I'm supposed to be in a leadership position and I'm getting told to do something that doesn't make sense, but I don't have the confidence to actually stand up and say something, that's not a good situation to be in. So you can be too humble. As a leader, it's important to be clear and concise in your conversations and in your directives towards people. So I always want to be simple, clear, and concise when I speak. Well, can you be too simple and too clear and too concise? Maybe you can't be too clear, but simple and concise, guess what? If you've got a mission that you're supposed to be doing, I'm telling you how I want it done, but I give you such simple direction that you're not really even sure which direction to go in, that's going to be a problem. So sometimes you can be too simple. So just about any characteristic or principle that a leader follows, if you take it to an extreme, it's going to end up hurting you. And that's why what you have to do is you have to take all these different dichotomies of leadership and you have to balance them.
And one of the dichotomies that caught my eye was chapter 6, aggressive, not reckless. You talk about the importance of balancing aggressiveness with caution and consideration. And I know in your books you talk about how you wanted your men to have a default aggressive mode. So where their first instinct was, let's get it done, let's do it now, and let's do it to the best of our ability. But why is it so important to have this balance on the battlefield of being aggressive but not reckless?
Well, if you see an enemy position and your default mode is, all right, we're going to immediately attack it, and you don't take the time to assess the actual threat level of that enemy position, then you end up charging uphill into a bunkered enemy machine gun with multiple machine guns with interlocking fields of fire, you're all going to get killed. So yes, you have to be aggressive, but if you're over aggressive, you can put yourself in a bad situation. And you know, I was thinking about this as you asked me that question earlier about, can I be too clear? And I thought to myself, well, no, you really can't be too clear. But then as I thought about it, that's actually not true. Because I can, if you're working for me, Solomon, and I say, okay, Solomon, this is the mission I want you to do, and here's exactly how I want you to do it, and here's the route I want you to take to the target, and here's the number of people I want you to take, and here's the method of entry I want you to do. So I make everything perfectly clear for you. Well, now what's happened is you are only going to follow those specific instructions, and you don't have the mindset to take a step back and say, you know what, Jocko told me to use this route, but I can see right now we're on this route and I see an enemy roadside bomb. I don't want to go down this road, but I gave you such clear directions. Don't you take any steps that I'm not telling you to take. I'm being so clear that it's actually going to end up hurting you. So really, it's truly any good characteristic that a leader can have. If you go to an extreme with it, it becomes a bad thing for a leader to be.
And on that point of having too much of something, being too extreme in one characteristic, one of the ones that caught my eye in this book, and I know I'm sure it's caught other readers' eyes, because you've written thousands of words on the importance of discipline, but it kind of goes back to this. In chapter 7, Discipline Not Rigid, you talk about how you can have too much discipline, the same there. Can you explain that concept too, how you can have too much discipline? Because I know your whole book, the one book is about how having discipline equals freedom, and we talked about that earlier.
Yeah, I mean, from a tactical perspective, if we have such disciplined standard operating procedures that every time we go up to a door where there's suspected enemy behind it, we're going to use a giant explosive breach to blow that door off its hinges, and disrupt and possibly harm anyone that's in that room, right? Seems like a good disciplined standard operating procedure. Well, one thing that happened on our deployment was Leif actually had his platoon. We were doing a big assault on multiple buildings in a neighborhood, and we did have that standard operating procedure. If we got to a door, we would put a giant explosive breaching charge on that door. We would blast that door open to startle and stun and surprise the enemy that could be waiting on the other side. Well, as Leif approached this door, outside the door, he saw a bunch of shoes, and a bunch of those shoes were little kids' shoes. And as soon as he saw that, he knew that what was behind that door was a bunch of little innocent kids. And he immediately made the decision, stop, don't breach this door. We're going to break it open with a sledgehammer. And sure enough, when they got the door open, they found a bunch of kids in that room. So that's a situation where Leif knew that he knew what the standard operating procedure was, but he also knew that if there was a time that you need to step outside that procedure, he had the flexibility to make that happen, but based on the decision he's making, and that turned out to be a great outcome.
Right, and once again, another dichotomy. You can go too far in one direction. It's important to have discipline, but not have too much of it. And of course, he showed that perfectly because, like you said, if he had blasted through that, think of the repercussions it would have had on the people who were already against the Iraq War, saying, look what they did. Mm-hmm. You know, they killed these kids, these innocent kids, and you know, like I said, who knows the repercussions it could have had. And yeah, he had the common sense to know that sometimes you can take things too far, and that's what the whole book is about.
Yeah, he had the freedom. Right? He had the discipline, which is here's the standard, but he also had the freedom to make adjustments if needed, and that's exactly what he did, and it was an outstanding call.
Now, one last point in this book. On page 218, you wrote, good leaders are rare, bad leaders are common. What do you think are the marks of a bad leader? The major marks of a bad leader in the sense of someone who fails to accomplish their mission.
What do you think? What do you think the biggest mark of a bad leader is?
Prideful.
What's that?
Prideful.
Yes, it's the opposite of humility, right? So someone that's ego gets in the way, someone that doesn't ever want to admit that they're wrong, someone that never wants to change their mind about anything, someone that doesn't listen to anybody else. Those are the people that blame everyone else and never think anything is their fault. That's the mark of a leader that is going to have some real problems and is going to drag their team down.
Right. You talked earlier about how it doesn't leave room for improvement, and of course, one thing I wanted to mention with you is what do you think? There are people who say, like, people who they're leaders who have bad convictions, evil convictions, but they know how to fire up a crowd. They know how to get people to follow them. Like, I don't know. Are those people, would you still call them bad leaders because they have bad convictions, or what would you call them? Because obviously they're leaders who are getting people under them, motivated to follow them, but for wrong reasons. What do you think of leaders like that?
Well, they are good leaders. I mean, clearly they're able to get people to follow them, and that's what, if you look at the technical definition of what a leader is, a good leader is someone that gets people to follow them. But what I find with those people in the long run, what they're looking out for is themselves. And when you're looking out for yourself, eventually, and you can make it far, eventually though, things will turn against you if you're not looking out for your team.
Yeah, like Saddam Hussein being found in a well.
Exactly right.
Everyone deserted him. Okay, anyway, The Dichotomy of Leadership, again, there's a link to purchase it below. It's a great book. Highly recommend you should buy it. Now, Mr. Willink, after the publication of Extreme Ownership, you found yourself in the forefront of discussion on leadership. Since then, you've written a series called Way of the Warrior Kid, which are books with leadership lessons in them for children. What made you want to begin writing these books for kids? Because I know it's a major shift, not in what you're teaching, but in audience and the way you write, and even the format, of course.
Yeah, well, I have 4 kids, and I've got one that's now 20 years old, one that's 18 years old, one that's 16 years old, and one that's 10 years old. But, you know, I raised them from when they were born, and a lot of things, as I saw them grow up, I saw the struggles that kids face, and I wanted to take some of the principles that I had learned in the SEAL teams in the military and apply them to the struggles that they were facing, and that's exactly what I did. And as I did that, eventually I looked around and said, it'd be nice to be able to show some other kids how to overcome the challenges that kids face, and that's what ended up propelling me to write those books.
And in the first book, Way the Warrior Kid, From Wimpy to Warrior, the Navy SEAL Way, it introduces the character, a young boy named Mark who's in 5th grade, and his uncle Jake, who is a Navy SEAL. What is the most important lesson from this book, the first one, that you were trying to teach kids?
The biggest thing in that book is, look, you're going to have problems. Everyone's going to have struggles and problems in life. That's what life is. Life is not always go the way you want it to go. But what you realize in that book, and what Mark learns from his uncle, is that these problems, if you face them and you actually attack them and you come up with a plan to overcome the problems, many problems that people face can be overcome. And that's the lesson. You don't have to be at the mercy of the world. You can actually step up, take ownership of what's going on, and solve a lot of problems yourself.
In this book, one of the things Uncle Jake helps Mark to do to get more discipline and I guess to have more purpose in his life is train in Jiu-Jitsu. You've done Jiu-Jitsu for a number of years. Did you start it as a kid like Mark did? Or
No, I did not start it as a kid. When I was a kid, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was not really even a thing in America.
Okay.
It didn't really come to America until the early 90s, and that is luckily enough for me. That's when I was able to start training. But all my kids trained Jiu-Jitsu growing up, and I see the benefits that Jiu-Jitsu has in helping kids in every aspect of their life.
What are some of those benefits?
You're going to get some physical conditioning. You're going to get some mental conditioning, because guess what? It's hard. And when you've got some other person that's bigger than you and stronger than you, and they take you down on the mat and they're grinding your head into the mat, it's not always fun. And so if you're going to persist through Jiu-Jitsu, you're going to have the discipline to get on that mat whether you wanted to go or not. And that's one of the best things about it. And then clearly you learn about how to defend yourself. And if you know some Jiu-Jitsu, you're probably not going to get picked on by anyone in your school. Can you always get picked on by someone if you're 10 years old and there's someone that's 18 years old? Yeah, that can happen. But you'll have a lot more sense about you. You'll have a lot more confidence. And the confidence will not just be fake confidence that's based on nothing. It'll be based on the fact that you know actual skills to handle yourself in bad situations. So I recommend Jiu-Jitsu to people all the time, and especially to kids.
Yeah, and for those of you who haven't read the books, throughout the rest of the book, in fact, here he is that the G? Is it called a G?
It's called a gi. Yeah.
Gi,
Yeah.
sorry. The suit. And I'll make a confession, I don't do Jiu-Jitsu.
Well, you're how old are you?
16.
Yeah, you can definitely get started anytime in the next few months, and that'll be fine.
Well, my dad and I talked about doing it, so I think I should now. But anyway, Mark trains Jiu-Jitsu through the rest of the books, and then his friends eventually join him in training Jiu-Jitsu. But back to this book, the first Warrior Kid book. My favorite chapter's got to be chapter 19, Presidents, Capitals, and Gettysburg. I know, shocking. In this chapter, Uncle Jake has Mark memorize all the presidents and the state capitals, and he has him memorize the Gettysburg Address from President Lincoln in 1863. Why do you think it's important for kids to learn history?
There's so many lessons that you can learn from history that will give you the depth of knowledge and the frame of reference to assess situations that you're in as an individual and make good decisions. And then you multiply that by the fact that when you get old enough in America, you're going to have the ability to vote for who's going to be in politics. And so it's very important that you understand the history of the country so that you can make good decisions about the people that you're putting into the government.
Yep, and we see that even more now, and that's of course an issue of young people voting that we've always faced, and even during the time, I forget what amendment it was, but the constitutional amendment that brought the age of voting from 21 to 18 was kids who wanted to have a say in the government, or I should say young adults now. But like you just said, it's important to have that foundation to keep building and keep learning so that when you come, you know what's worked before, you know what hasn't, you know what people we've had before, you know what their effect has been, and you know what to look for now. And I guess to see past people who are fake, and to be able to actually make judgments, to not just judge by somebody's TV face and how nice they can smile on TV. And but I think that's a great answer. And you guys know me. I think it's so important for kids to learn history. The second book, Way of the Warrior Kid, Mark's mission. What is his mission, and what important lessons does he learn trying to accomplish that mission?
Well, the big lesson in that book is he meets a kid that's a little bit of a problem kid, causes problems, picks on people a little bit, and just is kind of a rough kid. And, in the story, Mark decides that he's going to stand up to this kid and kind of put him in his place and possibly even fight him and utilize his jiu-jitsu for the first time for real. And his Uncle Jake says, okay, if that's what you feel like you have to do, but before you do something like that, you've got to gather some intelligence. You've got to find out why this kid acts this way. Because you have to analyze before you make an action like that. And so Mark goes through the process of trying to figure out, learn more about this kid, whose name is Nathan James, find out what is causing Nathan to act the way that he acts. And as he observes him and takes notes on the way he behaves, he realizes that part of the reason why he behaves that way is because of the situation that he's in. And Mark realizes that there's a lot more to people's behavior that you need to learn about, that you need to understand before, once again, like you just talked about passing judgment, before you pass judgment on someone, maybe you should try and figure out why they're acting that way. And instead of fighting them, maybe you can find a better way to help them, and that's what that story is about.
And that is such a practical life lesson. And these books, just so you guys know, these books are filled with lessons like that, where you read it and right away, and I've read reviews of these books, and I'm sure you have, of adults who say, these are kids' books, but these lessons, I wish I had read these books when I was a kid because of the lessons they teach, because they are, the best word for them is timeless. And that's especially a timeless lesson. Kind of back to that theme of bullies real quick before we move on to the last book. Are the bullies in your Warrior Kid books modeled on anyone you've known through your life?
Oh yeah, they're modeled on people that bullied me when I was a kid, for sure.
And did you have a time in your life when you were kind of like Mark? I guess in the first book, you were going along, and but you had someone who came and really helped you and mentored you and I guess steered you on the right path?
I would say that's more based on what my career in the SEAL teams was like, which is a lot of the guys that were older than me, that were more experienced than me, that were mentors to me, even if they never used that word, because that's word when I was growing up in the SEAL teams. It wasn't a word that got used a lot. No one said, oh, I want you to be my mentor. What it was there was people that looked at you and said, hey, if you want to be a good SEAL, here's what you got to do. And so I said, okay, I'm ready to do it, whatever it takes.
So your Uncle Jake was your military training?
Yes.
Okay. Wow. And then the last book for now, Way of the Warrior Kid, Where There's a Will. And this was published in May, right?
Yes.
Okay. What is the overarching message behind this book?
The big message I wanted to get across in that book is Mark is starting to realize ego, realize that he has an ego and how much that can hurt him. And it comes in the form of another kid that can do more pull-ups than him, seems to be smarter than him in the quiz that they take in school, even knows jiu-jitsu and has actually been training jiu-jitsu longer than him. And instead of him being, oh great, I've got this friend that I can model after, that can help me study, that can help me get better at jiu-jitsu, instead he starts to try and undermine him and looks for ways to cut him down. And that's how the story unfolds. It's once again, it's kind of a classic narrative of, you can look at someone that is an ideal, and instead of saying, oh wow, I could learn a lot from that person, I look at that person and say, I want to undercut them. And that's a classic parable, and it's one that plays out for Mark. Of course, luckily, Mark has Uncle Jake to kind of guide him and help him recognize the mistakes that he's making.
And I don't want to give too much of the book away, but my favorite part, well, one of my favorite parts was when Mark is kind of fuming because, like you said, Danny Reinhardt's kid's name can do all these other things, and Mark's thinking to himself, oh, okay, well, he can do that, but, you know, I can beat him in Jiu-Jitsu. And then, he, you know, Kenny and Nathan, I think, invite Danny to their Jiu-Jitsu place, which is Victory MMA, where we are right now. And Mark realizes that Danny's been training for a year longer than him, and the one thing he thought he could beat him at, Danny ends up being able to beat him at. But the one thing that you'll notice when you read this book is that Danny is not mean. He's not like these other bullies in these books. In the bully in Warrior Kid 1 is named Kenny Williamson, who fights with his fists, and the bully in Mark's Mission is Nathan James, who fights with his words. And Danny Reinhardt is, like I said, he's not mean. He always smiles, and you even say that on the back, and that's what makes Mark so mad, because he can't figure out why Danny's always smiling. But I'll leave you to wonder why he's always smiling when you go and read the book. Anyway, one last point before we end. Actually, in this book, on page 195, you had a quote I really like. It's Uncle Jake talking to Mark, and it's towards the end of the story. Uncle Jake says, "If you have a strong will, almost nothing can stop you." Now, the reason why that stopped me was because I hear all the time, and I'm sure you have too, people who look at kids and say, if you put your mind to it, nothing can stop you, which isn't a realistic view of life, and I've learned that to be true, and I'm sure you have, and I'm sure everyone who's listening to that has learned it to be true. So I wanted to thank you for putting that in there, because I think it's important to not give people, and I know you don't even like the term, you don't even like the idea of motivation, but false motivation, the idea that you can do anything if you put your mind to it. But Uncle Jake provides a realistic view of life, and I'm sure that's the way SEALs look at it. Do you have any marks in your own life that you've been in Uncle Jake too?
Well, now that those books have come out, there's been a lot of kids in the Warrior Kid podcast. I get letters from kids all over the world, actually. Well, all over the English-speaking world. And now that the books are being translated, starting to get some from other countries as well. But that kids see the example. And you know, if you notice in the first book, the ending of the first book is him saying, "Well, you're not going to be here anymore, Uncle Jake. How am I going to do all this stuff?" And Uncle Jake is saying, "You don't need me." And that's one of the points of the book, is you don't need someone. You understand what the ideas are, you come up with a plan. Anyone can come up with a plan. You take a look at what your problem is, come up with a plan to overcome that problem, and you try and attempt to execute that plan. And guess what? You might not get it right the first time. You might make some mistakes, and as long as you're humble enough to learn from those mistakes, you try a different plan, you make some adjustments to your plan, and you try again, and you keep trying and don't give up.
Right, and like you said earlier, that's another lesson from these books, that it applies to everyday life, and it's not just for kids, it's for anyone, and that's why these are kids' books, but it's why we talked about earlier that even adults read them and enjoy them. So no matter how old you are or what your interests are in life, these are great books with a lot of great lessons. So Your Way of the Warrior Kid series has been very well received by many people. You just said, you know, you've gotten letters and messages from kids all around the English-speaking world. Are there any pieces of encouragement you got from kids or adults that really stand out to you?
Oh, definitely. You know, every time I get a note or a message or a letter from a kid that at the beginning of the summer couldn't do any pull-ups and now they can do 7, you know, that memorized all their times tables, that memorized all the presidents, every one of those gives me encouragement. And you know, the flashcard thing with the times tables is actually something that happened with my oldest daughter. My oldest daughter came home from school one day saying, "I'm dumb." And I was very surprised to hear her say this, because I said, "What do you mean you're dumb? You're a smart kid." And she says, "No, I don't know my times tables. All the other kids know their times tables." And I said, "Well, how much have you studied them?" And she kind of looked at me and said, "What do you mean studied them?" And I said, "Well, how much have you reviewed them and tried to memorize them?" And she said, "Well, I haven't done that." And I said, "Well, how do you expect to know anything? You don't get born with this information in your head. You have to learn it. You have to work hard, and that's what it takes." And so we sat down and made flashcards, and an hour later, she knew her whole times tables. I was a bad dad for not recognizing that earlier.
Extreme ownership.
Yes, but once I recognize that, okay, now here's what we're going to do to fix the problem. So I get great encouragement when I read the letters and notes and messages from kids all over the place, and it makes me feel like kids are hearing the message, and that means I need to keep getting the message out there.
Yeah, and I listened to one episode of your Warrior Kid podcast where you had a kid from, I think it was Ireland, who messaged you, and I thought that was just great. And anyway, back about your podcast. So in addition to all of his writing, 7 books now, is that right?
Yes.
Yes, 7 books. You have 2 podcasts, the Jocko Podcast and the Warrior Kid Podcast. When did you decide to start each of them?
I started the Jocko Podcast is the one that's primarily about leadership and war, and really about human nature. And I started that one in 2015 after I was on a couple podcasts one was a guy named Tim Ferriss, one was a guy named Joe Rogan, and they both encouraged me to start my own podcast, and they were both very popular podcasters. And when people that have experience in a field advise you in a certain direction, and they have a lot of experience and success in that arena, then it's probably a good idea to listen to them. So I did, and I started that podcast talking about things that I like to talk about, things that I am intellectually curious about. And then once the Warrior Kid books came out, same thing. Some people don't like to read. Some kids don't like to read. I still want to get that message to them. So how do I do that? Well, another good medium is called a podcast, and they're growing in popularity all the time, but I have a great time doing both of them.
Yeah, and he's also got tie-in YouTube channels, so you can not only listen to all the episodes, but you can go on YouTube and see the Warrior Kid Podcast and Jocko Podcast episodes. And I've seen several of your Jocko Podcast things on YouTube. Excuse me. In what ways are you trying to help people of all ages with both of these podcasts? So the Jocko Podcast first.
Just trying to give people the lessons that I've learned from as many different angles as I can. And what I mean by that is if I tell you something one way, it's going to hit you one way, and maybe it doesn't hit you that well. But if I can make a comparison, or I can give a historical reference, or I can use someone else's quote or use someone else's story to try and teach you the same lesson from multiple different angles, there's a better probability that you'll take that lesson and you'll absorb it. And that's what my goal is.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, my mom was a school teacher for a number of years, and so she talks about, how kids would not only need the visual reference, they would need the audio reference and writing it. So yeah, that's very true, and that's a great thing about all the mediums we now have available, and you've utilized those so well, YouTube and books and podcasts. So, Mr. Willink, what's next? Do you have any other books in the works that you can share with us?
Well, I wrote another book that we didn't talk about today called Mikey and the Dragons, which is a book that's aimed at a little bit younger audience than the Way of the Warrior Kid, and it really, you've been asking me about the main themes of my books, and the main theme of that book is how to overcome your fears. And it's easy to forget when you get a little bit older, when you get to be 16 years old like you are, or 48 years old like I am. It's pretty easy to forget how scared we can be of things in the world. And what you have to do is you have to learn to overcome those fears. And so the book Mikey and the Dragons is about a little kid learning to overcome fears. Then I have another book coming out in January 2020. It's called Leadership Strategy and Tactics. It's another book really aimed at adults and adults that are in leadership positions, teaching them the pragmatic tactics and strategies of how to actually lead, what you actually have to do to lead in any situation. I'll have another Warrior Kid book coming out in the spring. That's the goal, of course. I am writing all the time. And I'm also writing right now a novel, which is an adult novel. So hopefully that will be probably coming out in 2021.
It's incredible. And do you see a specific number of books that you want to add to this series, or just however far you can go?
I'm going to take Mark through high school.
Okay.
So when he graduates high school and his next step in life becomes revealed, that will be the end of that series.
So we got a lot more to look forward to.
Yes.
And is the leadership tactics book kind of going to be like this one?
It's not quite like that. It is a field manual, but this book is definitely, it's longer, so that book is pretty concise. This leadership strategy and tactics field manual is not, it's not as concise as that book. It gives a little bit more detail. There's more, it unfolds more situations and describes more situations that people can be in, so it has to be a little bit more detailed than that book. That book is very straightforward, as you know. There's no minced words or no wasted text in that book. It's straightforward.
There is no hack. There is no it's shortcut first, right? Yeah, there is no shortcut. There's no hack. There's only one way to get after it. That's another one of his favorite phrases. Get after it. You see that on your Warrior Kid podcast. Well, anyway, if I have another question I think is important. If you could have people take away one lesson from all of your books, what would it be? What's the most important lesson you've ever taught?
It's really summed up in the titles of the books. I mean, the title of the book, Extreme Ownership, guess what? You have to take ownership of what's going on in your life, and this is something that people try to avoid. If you break that down to a personal level, what does that mean? It means personal responsibility. Take ownership of your mistakes. Take ownership of the outcome that you're going to be in. So that's definitely one. The next book, Discipline Equals Freedom. I promise you, the more discipline you have in your life, the more freedom you'll end up with. The Dichotomy of Leadership, guess what? You need to be balanced in your life. You can't be extreme in any direction. You've got to be balanced, and it's really easy to get sucked into situations where you become extreme. You've got to find the balance there. And so those themes are the same themes that are kind of outlined in all my kids' books as well, but those are the main themes and lessons that I try and propagate.
And now before we end today, just a couple more personal questions. Is it strange being famous?
You know, I don't really consider myself famous. I'm just a normal guy that's doing my job, and my job happens to entail talking to people, but I don't think I'm a famous person. I'm just a person.
I get what you mean, but I guess for someone like me who has 30 followers on Twitter compared to 40,000 followers on Twitter, but it's just incredible all you've built up, and it seems like you really it started after the publication of Extreme Ownership. Is that correct?
The publication of Extreme Ownership was definitely a big step, but from my perspective, really the thing that's fueled most of the popularity is the podcast, the Jocko Podcast. That definitely, the reach that has, because it's so consumable, because it comes out every week, because you can listen to it while you're doing other things. You know, when you ask someone to buy a book or to read a book, you know, if I say, here, I'll sell you this book for $10, you just don't have to give me $10, right? You have to give me $10, then you have to give me 8 hours or 10 hours of time that you have to now invest in this book to capture lessons. So that better be, I've got to give you a lot of value in that book. Well, with a podcast, it's a little bit different. First of all, you don't have to give me $10. It's completely free. And then the second part is, you don't have to invest anything. In fact, I'm going to allow you to take advantage of being able to listen to a podcast while you're doing some other menial labor, like mowing the lawn or doing the dishes or cleaning your room. I'm actually giving you a gift, which is, hey, you can get more from this time that would otherwise be wasted. Yeah. So because of that, you know, every episode of the podcast gets millions of downloads and listens. And that to me is an indicator that, you know, the book Extreme Ownership, which has been out the longest and therefore is the best selling of all the books, although they all continue to sell really well. It's pretty shocking. But, you know, that's a little over 2 million copies, but that book's been out for almost 4.5 years. So what does that mean? Well, it means that people will are less likely to make that investment to open up a book and labor through reading it. It's cutting into their time. Okay, but you give them a podcast that they can listen to at any moment while they're driving, while they're doing whatever they're doing. It's a real benefit, and I think that's what fueled the popularity. Even the popularity of Extreme Ownership, I think, is based on the podcast in many aspects. So
yeah, and I have just so you know, I have a friend who, somebody described it to me. Their copy of Extreme Ownership is like an old lady's Bible. It has so many bookmarks, so many highlights. It's worn. Like, you feel it, and it feels like a 100-year-old book. So yes, people are taking the books and spending the time and re-spending the time, 10 hours plus 10 hours plus 10 hours. I can only imagine how many times this one friend of mine has reread it. But just a couple last questions. Do you have any siblings?
Yes, I have 2 sisters, one older and one younger.
Are they afraid of you?
No. No, not at all.
You've mentioned in your book that you were a rebellious kid. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Well, I think a lot of kids go through a rebellious stage in their life, and I think part of that is a little bit of human nature, something embedded in you, because at some point you recognize, this safety and security that I have in my house with my family, hopefully in most cases, that I'm going to have to walk away from that safety and security. You know, they talk about birds being able to leave the nest, right? Well, when you start to realize that, I think most kids start to do that. They don't really know how to start making that transition inside their own mind. They know it's there. They know they're going to have to walk out on their own, but they're not quite sure how to prepare themselves for that. So they do the only thing they kind of know how, which is kind of reject some of the things that their parents are saying. And I certainly did that. And I was a rebellious kid. You know, I got into trouble when I was a kid, causing problems. I was a horrible kid to have in the classroom, and just was a raucous kid. I had a lot of energy.
Looking back now and being a parent yourself, what advice can you give to any kids who may be listening that are rebellious to their parents or their teachers?
Yeah, well, this is something that I figured out. The best form of rebellion is to do really well. That's, you know what, we want freedom. Even when I talk about, you know, at some point, Solomon, you're going to have to leave the nest, you're going to have to get out on your own, you're going to be free from your parents, you're going to be earning your own living, you won't be relying on anything. That's a great goal to have, and that's what we should want, to get freedom. And the best way to get freedom is to have discipline. And I learned this when I got to the SEAL teams. I didn't want to I didn't want to have to take orders from anyone. You know, I wanted to be the guy making up the rules myself. Well, I was a young guy, I was a radioman, and so what I actually did was, instead of being told what to do, as a radioman, which is the guy that carries the radio and gives out the radios to the other guys and makes sure they're programmed and makes sure that they're waterproof, I was the guy that was in charge of that. So, when we had a mission coming, I would do everything I could to have everything prepared, to have everything ready, to make sure all the radios were checked, to have the radios assigned, so that when my boss came to me and said, "Hey, Jocko, this is what we need," I'd look at him and say, "I already did it." So, by performing well, by doing well, if you want to be a rebel in the positive way. Don't be a rebel in the negative way, and you're going to end up in a much better position in life. And luckily, I joined the military, because that's where I learned that. I learned from joining the military that, the best way for me to be a rebel is to work as hard as I can and try and be the best SEAL that I can possibly be. Because what I want is freedom. I want to be able to do what I want, and that's what allowed me to do it.
Kind of almost, well, I guess not put it this way, but rebelling against the part of you that wants to be lazy or disobedient, and to just tell that instinct no, and because that comes in all of us, and we all have that urge, like I talked about earlier, to rebel against authority. But yeah, I think that's a great point.
You actually brought up the fact that people have an instinct to rebel against authority. It's part of human nature, and thank God we have that instinct to rebel against authoritarian people that want to demand that you do certain things. But if you can take that, you can harness it, and you can use it in a positive way, that's what will make your life infinitely better than rebelling for the sake of rebellion. And in most cases, not in all cases, but in most cases, your parents actually have a very good intent for you, and they're asking you to do things, and they're pointing you in a direction, not because it's going to be bad for you, they're pointing you in a direction because they know that will be good for you. And so that sometimes what gets involved there is our ego. Is we don't want, when you're a young kid, when I was a young kid, guess what my parents knew? Guess what they knew?
About you?
About everything. What do you think my parents knew when I was 15 years old? What do you think they knew?
Zero.
They didn't know anything. You're right. I thought I was the smartest guy in the world. What could my dad possibly teach me about life? He doesn't know anything. Who's that old guy over there, right? That's what I thought to myself, is how can this guy know anything? How can my mom know anything? And when you get a little bit older, you realize, they actually did know things, and I should have listened. And I'm not saying I was a horrible kid, because I wasn't. I wasn't a horrible kid at all. But I certainly was a rebellious kid. Now I have kids of my own, and my kids can be rebellious at times. And when they're rebellious to me from a parent's perspective, I don't get mad at them for rebelling against me. I said, okay, there it is. That's the free will of a young human being that wants to make their own decisions, and I don't oppose it. But I won't bang heads with my kids. I'll say, well, why do you want to make that decision? Why don't you explain to me why I won't say I won't just say to them, hey, look, that's a dumb decision and here's what you should do.
Yeah, because then
they'll butt heads with me.
Yeah.
Instead I'll say, well, why do you think that's a good way to do it? And I'll hear them out, I'll listen to them. Maybe I can learn something from them. But in many cases, as they talk through decisions that they're making, they recognize that it's probably not the best decision. And guess what? This is the same principle that you use as a leader. If you're going to make a decision to do an operation or a project some way, and I know it's not the best decision, I don't go, hey, Solomon, you're stupid, that's a bad way to do it. No, instead I go, hey, why are you going to do the project that way? What's driving you to make that decision? And now you start to explain it to me, and maybe I ask some questions that guide you to discover for yourself that, oh, there's a better way to do this. And now you look at me, you know what, actually, Jocko, I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to do it this way. And I go, that's wonderful. You're really smart.
Yep.
And I really just fed you that, just guided you in the right direction, which is what we're trying to do.
And that's such a wise way to interact with people. And if everybody in the world took that advice, the world would be a much better place. Anyway, last question. If I ever have problems with someone, can I threaten to come and have you beat them up?
No, you can't threaten to have me come beat people up. What you should do is you should start training jiu-jitsu. You should learn some good skills there. And then what you'll find is, number one, the better you know how to fight, the less chance you will actually have to fight. And we can look at, I know you're interested in history, but if you look at sort of Ronald Reagan's theory is, hey, if we're stronger than everyone else on the block, then we don't have to get in fights with anybody.
Peace through strength.
Yes, peace through strength. And so that attitude in your personal life is a great attitude to have. I know when I was a young, dumb, 19-year-old guy, I was much more apt to get into a fight than I am now, and now I'm incredibly skilled because I train to fight all the time. But the chances of me using it now are very minimal because I know how to avoid these situations, and most people can tell just by the way you act, oh, this person is confident that they probably know what they're doing, and I'm not going to press this any further. So I'm not going to beat people up for you, Solomon.
No. You
need to learn to do it for yourself so that you can have peace through strength.
Well, I will take that advice, and I'm going to make an effort to start jiu-jitsu.
Awesome.
Don't go just yet, everybody. It's time for the... Mr. Willink, what is your favorite meal?
Steak.
Favorite movie?
The Pacific, which is actually a series, a mini-series on HBO.
What's your favorite book?
About Face by Colonel David Hackworth.
Favorite person from history?
Colonel David Hackworth.
And favorite hobby?
Jiu-Jitsu.
Jiu-Jitsu. Good hobby. And you're an instructor in jiu-jitsu, right? And
I am.
And that's what, like I said in the video, if you saw earlier, we're in Victory MMA gym right now. And do you do classes here?
Yes.
Okay. And do you have any other thing besides jiu-jitsu that you like to do? Other things that you do in your personal time, your free time?
Yeah.
Do you play any instruments?
I surf and I play guitar.
Oh, sister loves guitar.
Good for her.
Comment below and tell me what the most important leadership lesson is you learned from this interview. Please give this video a thumbs up, click that subscribe button, and ring the notification bell to stay up to date with all my videos. And until next time, go learn your history.